Hello bookish friends, my name is Gail and I am the Fiction Bookworm. So I'm really excited that you joined me today because I'm going to talk about my favorite genre of books, which is probably really more of a subgenre of historical fiction or maybe contemporary fiction, and it is the dual timeline novel, or some people call them time slips. So I first fell in love with these dual timeline novels, I would say at least 15 years ago, or maybe even a little bit more, when a friend suggested that I read Possession by A.S. Byatt. And I don't think I'd ever read another novel quite like this before, and I just completely fell in love with this concept of having a modern story, especially one that's maybe a little bit of a mystery that needs to be solved about something in the past. And then we actually go into the past to see kind of what is actually happening and meet the people that the story is about. So in the case of Possession, it's about two English academics. One is a doctor and one's a PhD student who are trying to find out what happened between these two famous, or not so famous, but sort of famous authors from the 19th century. And so they have this idea that the two of them maybe met, even though no one seems to know if this really happened, but a diary entry seems to show that maybe these two people met and influenced each other's work, or they were somehow involved. And so we go into the past and we find out what really happened between the two of them, between this man and this woman. And so it's really interesting, and A.S. Byatt has written so creatively because she's included a lot of the literature that these two are writing, like poetry and things that they were writing. And so it's like sort of a literary feast, because we have kind of this literary topic of the mystery, but then also we have all of this literature that these not real people have produced, that Byatt wrote herself. So it's really a fun and complex story, and there's just so much richness to the story. And once I read it, and it has probably jumped into my top 10 books of all time and has stayed there ever since I read it, I was just like, I want more books like this. Are there more books like this? And so that's when I began my quest to find more and more dual timeline novels. So I want to share some others that I have found, and some authors who write these kinds of novels that I really love. So probably the next series that I found sort of like this is much more commercial and popular, and this is the Pink Carnation series by Willig. I have not actually finished this series. I started this series when she first wrote it, and then my life kind of took a turn and I moved overseas, and I got a little bit of away from reading some of the books that I really enjoyed because I couldn't get them where I moved to. And so I still need to finish this series, so that's one of my goals, I think, for the next year, is to finish this series. I do really like it. It's again on a literary topic, and it is about historical research into the Scarlet Pimpernel, as if the Scarlet Pimpernel was a real person rather than just a literary figure that we know from a novel. And so there is a modern day story with an academic who's doing research on the Pink Carnation, and then each book follows someone involved in the League of the Scarlet Pimpernel, which is, there is like a whole group, I think, of spies, all with flower names. And so this is the first in that series, and it's just fun. You know, it's not quite as literary as Possession, but it's just fun. It's a fun novel. Another author that I found who writes these kinds of dual timeline books is a woman named Susan Meisner. And this is my favorite of her books. It's called Lady in Waiting, and it is about Lady Jane Grey from the Tudors, the Tudor fame, who was Queen of England for 11 days. And it is about a modern day woman in New Hampshire, Connecticut area, who owns a whose husband has just left her, but she owns a antique store, and she somehow gets this shipment from England that contains this ring, which we learn belonged to Lady Jane Grey. And so we flip back and forth between Jane and the modern day story, where she is trying to deal with, you know, what is her life like now that she's separated from her husband. She has a son who's in college, and it's just a really great story. I've never been married, and so it's, you know, the story of a woman who's kind of been left. Is maybe not one that I would immediately resonate with, but I love this story so much that I've read it twice, maybe even 3 times. So this has been, it's, you know, it's a kind of a simple story, but it's one that I just really enjoy reading a lot. So another book of Susan Meisner's that I really have enjoyed, that's this dual timeline, is A Fall of Marigolds, and that is a story that is set in 2 timelines. Neither one is contemporary, but one is sort of contemporary in that it takes place a few years after September 11, and so it's about a woman who lived through the fall of the towers in New York City, and her husband was killed in that terrorist act, and she happens to be wearing a scarf that day that has a past that she's trying to research, and this scarf is also owned by a woman who came to America and landed in Ellis Island. And so it's really the story of these 2 women, this one woman who's immigrating via Ellis Island, and then another woman also in New York who has lived through this tragedy and lost her husband. So it's just the story of these 2 women. It's very powerful, and I really liked it, and I think it's one that is, I think could resonate with a lot of people. So some other dual timeline novels that I have read and enjoyed include this one called A Tangled Mercy by Joy Jordan Lake. So A Tangled Mercy is set in modern day Charleston, or close to modern day Charleston, South Carolina, and it's about a woman who has been working on a thesis about the slave uprising that happened in Charleston, South Carolina back in 1822. And she's doing some research on that and trying to find out some of the history. And so the story is set in both 1822 and, like I said, in fairly recent Charleston. And so we learn about sort of what happened in the slave revolt, but then also we see events that are happening today that affect the African American community. And it's a really powerful story. Part of the novel is kind of set around Mother Emanuel, which is a famous African American church that you may remember from a shooting in the past few years. This is a really good novel, a little more on the serious side. And then last year I read 3 really great dual timeline novels that I just absolutely fell in love with. One is a familiar author, as I had already mentioned, Lauren Willig, and this is The Glass Ocean. And this is a triple author novel written by Lauren Willig, Karen White, and Beatrice Williams. And so they each wrote one POV character in 2 different timelines. And so there's 2 women in who are aboard the Lusitania, and then there's one modern woman who's doing some research about that tragedy. And so I read this novel because I already knew Lauren Willig, and it's really fun to read these 3 ladies and their writing because they don't reveal which one of them wrote which POV character. They trade off chapters, and so you're kind of just left wondering, okay, which author wrote with which chapter? And it's a really interesting story. I really liked it. You can kind of see the magic of the Lusitania. It's very much like the Titanic, this grand ship where very wealthy people traveled, but also less wealthy people traveled, and how the classes were separated. And there's a bit of a love story in this novel, and it's really great. It really hits my sweet spot of things that I like about a book. Another book that I read last year that I really enjoyed is The Lost Vintage by Anne Ma. And this is a World War II and contemporary story. The contemporary story, I think, is more the main story, and the World War II story is kind of flashback. So it's sort of similar to another dual timeline book that I'm not really going to talk about too much in this video because I've talked about in previous videos, which is The Winemaker's Wife. So the two of them are very similar in that they're both set in vineyards during World War II, during the German occupation, and, you know, just kind of deal with a lot of the things that the French people had to go through with the Germans occupying their country. And of course, there's, I think, a Jewish tie into this story because that was a really important part of the war in France, was what ended up happening with all of the French Jewish people. You know, a lot of people tried to protect them, but the Germans were trying to send them east into the concentration camps. So this was a really great novel. I loved Anne Ma so much. She's a great writer. She's not written a lot of other things. I just got one of her previous novels in last month, and I'm hoping to read that as well very soon. And then this is a novel that I have the advanced reader copy for that I read last fall as well, called The Phantom Tree by Nicola Kornick. And this is another dual timeline novel that I really enjoyed. It's set in the Tudor period and in modern times. And so you have this like Tudor story, and kind of reminds me a little bit of Philippa Gregory and the things that she's written. And then you have a modern story with someone who has done some research on the time period and actually owns this older Tudor period home, and then a young woman. And it's a little bit mysterious about the connection that she has to the older timeline. And so I love when, I guess, a bunch of different elements come together. We've got history, we've got contemporary, we've got this mystery that's going on. And so it just ties together all the things that I love in a novel. There's a little bit of romance. So it's like the perfect recipe for a great book for me, to have all those elements combined in one. I really love The Phantom Tree. This was definitely a 5-star book for me. And it is pretty high on my list of books that I love. So I highly recommend it. So I can't talk about dual timeline novels without talking about Susanna Kersley. And so she is kind of a master at dual timeline novels because most of her novels, I feel like, are set in 2 different timelines. So there's usually some kind of magical element that connects the 2 timelines in some way. And so, for example, the first book that I read of hers was called The Winter Sea, and it's set in Scotland. And the magical element that combines the 2 timelines is ancestral memory. And so the main character has dreams in which she sees an ancestor of her kind of living out her life during the first Jacobite rebellion in Scotland. And so she's kind of writing a novel, but it's like the true story of this ancestor of hers who she keeps dreaming about. And then there is a sequel to that one called The Firebird, and that one is actually has some ties to Russia, and the characters in that novel actually visit St. Petersburg, and the main character in that novel is able to go to a place and then see like what happened, something that happened in that place. And when that happens, then the story veers off into the historical story. And so I really love Susanna Kersley's writing because she is so good at talking about places. And so if you ever like read a book and you feel like, oh, that was like a vacation to some place, that's what Susanna Kersley's writing is like. One of my favorites of hers is called Splendor Falls, and it's set in this little town of Chinon, France. And it is just so rich in detail about Chinon that you just feel like you're there. You know, I feel like I've been there and I've stayed at this hotel and I've walked the square and I've visited the castle. Just because her writing is so rich in writing about place. And that's one of the things that I love about novels is when they make me feel like I've been there, you know, like I've gone on a little vacation to France. Another author that I know is very famous for doing these dual timeline or time slip novels is Kate Morton. And I confess, I have two, actually I think I have 3 of her books. I have 2 right here. I think I have another one. And I have not read them yet. And I keep hearing about her books and how great they are, but I just haven't gotten into them yet. Maybe it hasn't been the right time. But if you've read Kate Morton and you really recommend her, I would love for you to make a comment and put it below this video to convince me maybe to read one in the next month. So please let me know what you think of Kate Morton. And I'd love to know if you know of any other authors who write these kinds of dual timeline novels. I'm not talking about time travel novels in this particular video because I'm going to do another video on time travel novels because I also really like those. So, but if you know of any of these dual timeline or time slip novels that are just set in 2 different timelines, and the stories are somehow connected maybe by a mystery or a magical element, I'd love to hear about them so that I can read them. So thanks for watching, and I hope that you have a good time reading. Bye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a like and be sure to subscribe to my channel. See you next time.